Well, it's 10:01, so let's kick things off, folks. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Cody Parr. I'm with HDR, and I want to welcome everybody to the July edition of the Southeast chapter of the AAAE's Coffee Conversations. This is a somewhat monthly informal gathering of the chapter to discuss ongoing topics that we are facing in our industry and within our organization. And I want to introduce my moderator, Greg Heaton with CMT, who will be leading the conversation today. I want to thank Greg and CMT for sponsoring this coffee conversation. And if your organization is interested in sponsoring or putting on a coffee conversation, I'm going to be posting Ryan Sizemore's email address in the meeting notes. Feel free to reach out to Ryan if you would like to get involved as well. So with that, I will just ask folks, if you are unmuted, just to check your mute button real quick. This is an informal meeting, so we certainly appreciate folks butting in to ask questions or to offer your perspectives. That is encouraged, but if you are not planning to speak, just please stay muted while you are. So with that, I will hand it over to Greg.
Thanks, Cody. Good morning, everybody. And as I joked, hope everybody's got their coffee with them. Sorry that this makes it wonderful to do it virtually, but sorry we all can't be down at the collective coffee shop to get everybody filled up for the discussion. So as Cody mentioned, thanks for being here. We titled it, show me the money. We were going to focus and talk a little bit about some of the funding programs, challenges therein, successes as well. Hope everybody will join in the collective conversation. And during, we've got a few slides that we'll show, but we intended for that to be very brief, such that we can really just engage in conversation. Let me dive in, and the bios were with the announcement, so I won't want to do it much, but I do want to very, very briefly cover our two folks that are going to chat today. Dave Long, whose title consummates an airport advocate. Dave has over 25 years prior to his time with CM&T at the Kansas City airports, and over 30 years in this business. Dave is skilled at maximizing revenues, both aeronautical and non-aeronautical revenues in all its many forms, as well as has a very strong background in airport development with his time at the facilities there. And so we'll hear from Dave this morning as it relates to some of these successful funding endeavors, as well as Allie Fields. Allie serves as our Community Enhancement and Government Affairs Director at Crawford Murphy & Tilley. Prior to her time with CM&T, she was a top policy advisor to a member of Congress. As part of the House T&I committee with that member of Congress, she has worked on passage of several key transportation-related funding bills. Those relate to things like the FAST Act, couple rounds of the WRDA bill, and FAA's last reauthorization in 2018. Allie helps us and our many clients tackle funding challenges, providing a strategic assistance to that, identifying funding sources, grant writing, and has led many successful pursuits, including the highly competitive RAISE and Infra grants. So that's the roles they play with us across our firm and the many clients, and ask them to talk today. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Allie, and we'll dive into our conversation.
Great. Hi, all. I'm going to do what is still dreaded after 2 years of all being virtual part-time and try to share my screen here. There we go. Okay. Thank you all. And as Greg mentioned, really going to try to keep this quick in the PowerPoint and not keep you too long on that, but would love to have this be a discussion of what folks are hearing out in the field. And particularly, we're lucky because this happened to be timed right after the first round of the FAA's airport terminal program has come out. And so we can have a little bit of a discussion on what we saw in that first round and what we might be seeing coming up. So this is going to be a refresher to, I think, everybody in our world, but just wanted to start us all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about with some of these programs, because fundamentally it's been a lot of money that's come into the aviation sector in the last couple of years since the CARES Act. But not as much of it focused on specifically on the infrastructure needs until that last infrastructure bill. So I think there is a perception outside our industry that airports have done very, very well in the last few years without necessarily recognizing both the challenges that folks have faced and also the kind of mounting needs on the infrastructure side. So in 2020, we had in March, the CARES Act, $10 billion that was went out through a formula that someone understands somewhere, but 9.9 billion to primaries, 100 million to GA and non-primaries through that bill. Starting with CRISA in December 2020, went with a formula from FAA that followed a little bit closer to what we're used to on AIP, $2 billion in that. And then ARPA in March 2021 is that Rescue Plan Act. So the airport rescue grants, $7.1 billion for primaries, 100 million for GAs through that. And again, all of these were geared toward just general economic assistance, right? And recovering from the pandemic and preparing for the next one, or hopefully not a next one, but building our resilience and our readiness. It wasn't until finally November 2021 we get that long, elusive, massive infrastructure bill, and that we're going to refer to both as IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and like FAA does, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL. And again, that's 25 billion total for aviation over 5 years in that bill. But the programs that we really care about, right, are the airport infrastructure grants and airport terminals program. And the $5 billion that goes into the airport terminal program, that's our first competitive grant program out of all of these, where it is actually an opportunity to compete against other projects and make the case. And so that's what we want to spend a little bit more time digging into when we've got the slides up today, is the first round of that. The 15 billion then is for the airport infrastructure grants. Again, these are formula money. FAA calls it AIG, to sound just like AIP, but this is formula money. And for the first 4 years will be just formula. In that 5th year, they'll start rolling some of the unused money from the first 4 into some competitive grants. And we can talk a little bit about that too. And again, just as we're looking at this and we're thinking toward next year when there's going to be an FAA reauthorization, this is all on top of normal AIP. So again, there may be a perception outside this group that there has been a ton of money coming in. But again, we'll get, as Dave's going to talk about next, we'll talk about the airport terminal program. And you can really see that there's a lot more needs than the money, even with this big infrastructure bill we've just had.
So good morning, Dave Long here. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit is really the FY22 awards. There were 90 of them that were actually awarded. Hey, a lot of you folks as airport operators aren't too happy. I think we could probably list 60 projects for each airport that put something that they thought that their project was more important than, or a better project than probably 60 out of the 90. How long you go, but let's take a little deeper dive on where this $969 million go. So I kind of broke it down into both airport categories, the FAA region, and then the Southeast chapter. How did you guys do compared to the rest of the country as far as all that? And as it says, spoiler alert, you guys did pretty well. And it's also a reminder that this is a 5-year program. And as Ali said, it's basically $1 billion a year, and it could be more than that. Timeline, because if the money isn't spent, this $5 billion within that 5-year period, it can be allocated in the years, in future years, in year 6 and even 7 or 8, moving forward. Next slide out. So the top 4 non-hubs, small hubs, medium airports, and large airports, those dollars were actually allocated by statute, okay? So, but just break that down just a little bit more. You did get about $18 million for the general aviation airports. One lone reliever got 540,000, and then the cargo services airport with about $5 million. But it is a good idea that the larger airports, by statutes, gets about half of the funds that are available. And so you got to look at your categories. So you're really not fighting for the $1 billion number. You're really fighting for whatever airport that you have within that particular slot, just as a reminder. Next slide. So we broke it out into FAA regions. And for the most part, each region got pretty much about the same amount of money, unless you're the central region. So if you're from Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, or Nebraska, for a mere $60 million. Somebody got some snow removal equipment or something, but the rest of the allocations seem pretty, within line of what one would think. Next slide, please. Now, out of the 90 projects within the Southeast chapter, everybody got at least one project, as many as 3 for the state of Florida, except South Carolina. So as a region, as a conference, to get every state but one on that, in other words, 18 out of the total of 90 projects, which really equates to 20% of the available around the projects that were actually awarded. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good number there. Next slide. And if you look at that as far as the money, again, South Carolina with that didn't have any. Georgia, Florida, all these airports in Virginia did very well, mainly with 1 or 2 grants within those airports or within those states. Really helped out on that. But out of all that, you ended up with 24% of the actual money that was allocated. And if you look at the 6 AAAE chapters, in theory, each chapter should be about 17%. And you ended up getting 24%, which is a really good number compared to those folks in the central region, for example. Next slide. Back to you, Allie.
Great, thanks, Steve. So before we take down the PowerPoint and just start a discussion, wanted to talk a little bit about what we expect next. So the first thing is if you did put in on this first round of ATP and weren't awarded, if you were awarded, congratulations. But if you weren't awarded, as Dave said, it's a 5-year program. And so we expect the second year of the program, FAA is going to try to move pretty quickly to get it out the door. And so there is an opportunity here to take advantage of having put the time into that form the first round and ask for a debrief from FAA on your application. This is pretty common at USDOT to do for other competitive grants, and with FAA, processes are usually a little bit different, but because they're running this way, would encourage you to ask, what do you see in my application? It was a limited space, right, to articulate the point of your project and how it met the criteria. So really good to hear from FAA, really what they were seeing from your application and what you can tighten up next time. We did see that a lot of these projects that were awarded in the first round were designed to be under construction by the end of the fiscal year or early in next fiscal year. And so, even questions about whether your project readiness came across in the application, I think is really useful before we go into the next round. I'll also say there are a lot of projects in this list that frankly seem like that they have been queued up for a long time, and we can talk more about some of those, but we know there were members of Congress who, between the passage of the bill and the signing in November and this program rolling out in February, were out at airports, essentially stumping for projects in their district. And if you've got the opportunity to do that kind of thing or have outreach to members of Congress, would really encourage you to do that between round 1 and round 2 and share what you heard from the first round. On ATP round 2, we have heard that FAA is trying to get it out in September, open the applications in September. I think sometime this fall is realistic, depending on all the different things that are going on at FAA. But we've also heard that, the application may change, and we can talk a little bit about that too. And then finally, the infrastructure bill is not the end all and be all of these funding. So we've seen earmarks return over these last 2 years of fiscal appropriations. They may continue into the next one. They may not, depending on the outcome of this election in this fall. But we can realistically anticipate that, members of Congress are going to still try to have a hand in how this money goes out the door, whether it's AIP, supplemental, or part of the infrastructure bill. And then they're all gearing up for next year, doing reauthorization in 2023. So last week, the House Transportation Committee had a hearing, really starting to gear up for reauthorization and talk about GA issues. I think we're going to see a lot more of that over the next few months, and then folks will wait until seeing how the election shakes out. But there will be, efforts to boost AIP. There will be efforts to reform different programs. So if you've got projects on your mind, it's a really good time to be reaching out to members of Congress or having conversations within the industry about how to make sure that that reauthorization is a step forward for everybody and for your airport as well. So that's what I got, Greg.
Sorry, I was just trying to find the unmute button. Thanks, Allie. Great. So we'll stop sharing those slides and dive into hopefully what is some conversation. We'll monitor the chat. You're welcome to type it in, or you can unmute and throw a question out. Otherwise, I've got a few that I can lead with, but I would love to hear back from the group and might ask, are there any questions about what Allie and Dave have just run through by way of a little bit of recap? Okay. If not, Allie, can I ask you to elaborate? Would folks have the debrief with their ADO, or are there others beyond that we might encourage folks to reach out to? Seemed a little mixed as to how involved ADO staff may or may not have been in the review of applications. Obviously, we were aware of a couple that sought answers to questions to sponsors during the process, but for many it was quiet as could be, and their response would be, we don't know anything about it. So
yeah, you can certainly go to headquarters and ask for a debrief. I would suggest that folks start with a conversation with the ADO. And I think what we found was the ADOs were maybe a little more involved in the review process than they initially let on that they would be about the ATP, particularly in this question of project readiness. And I think a number of airports that we work with got questions from the ADO in the weeks that followed the application deadline about environmental, about where they were in the process. As you talk about whether it's, about meeting the criteria or no red flags, I think the ADO is where to start on, were there any red flags about my application where you didn't feel comfortable sending it on to headquarters? Because they definitely did a review and a pass before things went into the full group.
gotcha. Thanks, Allie. A couple of questions popped in. Of the projects that were awarded, were any for planning and design, or were they all sort of a shovel-ready construction driven project?
Yeah, and to my knowledge, no design funds in this first round. I think the definition of shovel ready definitely was variable for FAA in this first round. I know a number of projects had bids in hand and that they were really excited about. There are other projects where there may have needed to be some revisiting of designs and updates. One is with the tower program. But I think that they were looking for shovel ready. And there's an indication that in the FAQs for ATP that, and we've heard this from Shanetta Griffin as well, that in future rounds, they believe that design awards may be more competitive, but in this first round, they really wanted to get shovels into the ground. And they also wanted really visible projects in this first round where this was going to be, obviously everything's going to be public facing, but something where people would see the impact of the infrastructure bill right away. And so again, some expectation that may change in future rounds in terms of design and planning money, but first round, all construction oriented.
Thank you. And that was a great question. And I'm going to continue to implore the group. I hope no one out there feeling like maybe you have the magic formula and got all the money you wanted and don't want to share any of the secrets. We are certainly happy to share successes we experienced, and love to say that I had some magic pixie dust that is sprinkled and it all worked. Might have just been a lucky day, but I would certainly encourage you all to feel free to raise observations and share it amongst the group as part of this just coffee chat. Thanks, Allie. Been another question, and I think it leads us into a little bit. How do you recommend a sponsor start positioning for the reallocation of unused funds from this first round of ATP? So I think that's a great question as you look not only this first year, but the years that follow. And I'd love to expand upon Cody's question and ask, might that relate to ultimately AIG funds, which we haven't touched upon a great deal, as well, and how they might approach those.
Yeah, Greg and Dave and others, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. My thought in terms of positioning for the unused ATP funds is to keep going through the competitive process, right? I think that they will probably, and we saw this with supplemental in the last couple of years, right? That first year that we had FAA supplemental a few years ago, it was a big NOFO and a great big process. And then, they started picking from things that had applied in the first round, projects they knew of through the normal AIP process. And so I think the biggest thing would be to make sure you've got an application in for the normal ATP program. In some of USDOT's other programs, like outside FAA, that is exactly how they put out that recycled money of a project didn't work out or a project came in under budget, is to say, hey, I know you applied for FY24 ATP money, but if you can get it done quickly enough and the funds won't expire, would you take FY22 ATP money? And can you get that project going fast enough? Dave, do you have thoughts on that?
I think in this is on this round of funds that we keep saying the word competitive, right? You know what I mean? And it is just that, it is competitive. So whatever you can think and do and put the catchphrases or the proper terms that you think would catch the eye to those that are reviewing this, and hence the reason why you want to, as Ali said, have that conversation with the ADO, and the fact that you are limited to 256 characters to describe your project. All of those did not really, it's very difficult to explain a complex project the way that their procedures actually came through. So I hate to say the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but you know what? In this case, on that particular funding of funds, I think the more you try, the more you adjust your application to meet those catchphrases and those things that are important to Congress right now, I think will be you may not still get the project, but you might go a little higher up on the food chain on each time that you actually supply or submit one of those things.
Yeah,
Ali, do you want to go ahead and talk about perhaps some of the, I kind of teed you up there on the application process and what's a little different this time that you see than last time?
Sure. Yeah, and jury's still out where they will end up on it. But it was pretty funny talking to folks at FAA during this application process, because even before applications were due this time, heard some indications from them that they plan to change the application for round 2, because they were hearing a lot of frustration from people about this word count and character limit format they'd set up. I'm quite confident they got a lot of people who didn't listen to the directions and attached a lot more information than just that form. But I do expect that they're gonna at least get rid of that quirky character limit setup. One of the things you touched on, Dave, that I think is really important. I mean, I would encourage everybody, if you're looking toward this program for the future, FAA has on their bipartisan infrastructure law website, the airport terminal program focused one, and I can drop this in the chat, where they announced the awards. They put up a quirky looking map of all the projects and the locations, but they also bunched them into categories, and they track the categories from the application a little bit in terms of, you may remember if you applied, there was expand capacity, there was good paying jobs. But the categories they bunched them in were expand capacity, better accessibility, serving smaller communities, greater sustainability, and new tower. And those, again, are close to what the criteria sections were, but they're a little bit different. It wasn't serving smaller communities. It was, I think it was enhancing competition, right? Was how it was worded in the application. So I think that that may be a preview of how this next round will look, is whether they use more of that terminology of accessibility, smaller communities, sustainability. If you go through the list of projects that were awarded, they give the little blurb on each one. And one thing you'll find is that almost all of them include the phrase ADA, right? People integrated that into all of them. And I think that probably FAA was looking for that as a baseline in the description of a lot of projects. So something to look for there. A lot of them also include LEED certification, not necessarily committing to it, but shooting for it. And so FAA was able to check the boxes with some of these on that kind of language for both the sustainability and the accessibility piece.
Allie, there was 10 billion, I think, if I'm right, in asks for the $1 billion in awards, so they could cover the whole 5 years program. Do we have any sense of, will I have to redo my app? If I want to write it better this next time, how do I withdraw my last one? Any insights at all in that regard, or any chance that going back to the supplemental, they asked for that, weeded out the bronze statue request, the senseless ones still had more than they needed. So I felt like they didn't really come back around in subsequent years fully. They were like, we got a good list. And thus, to your earlier comments, they sort of leaned themselves back up on the AIP and let the administration kind of weave it in the stuff they had. Any chance of that, or any discussion you think that they might, or feel pretty solid they'll year over year make asks and let people reapply or whatever?
Yeah, this is all trying to read the tea leaves. It's up to FAA how to handle this. I do think that at least for FY23, that there will be a new application, maybe slightly different, and you'll need to resubmit. Maybe you don't need to resubmit, but I think it's very likely you do have to. You'll note that the timing of them trying to get that out in September may even include trying to have applications in and some hints at awards before the election. I think that's unrealistic, but it's totally possible. And I think that, particularly given that we even saw FAA put out a notice of funding opportunity for AIP this year, I think they'll take the opportunity to put out a new notice and have a new process at least this coming fiscal year to indicate that, we're driving at these priorities and we're running a fair and open process for this bipartisan infrastructure law money. After that, your guess is as good as mine. Sometimes it's a matter of efficiency. Sometimes it's a matter of knowing they do have the queue of applications. And so I would say, again, if you think that you've got a project over these next several years that's going to be an ATP, even if it's not shovel ready this year, even if it's not quite ready for prime time, I do think it's worth trying to get an application in these early rounds so that you're on the radar, because they're mapping out 5 years of funding right now.
Thank you. To the group, again, we'll pause for a second. Allie knows I'm going to continue. I got lots of questions for her, and happy to share my own successes in the first round for anybody who wants to know. But anybody out there? Comments? Want to unmute and ask a question, or all right, don't say I didn't pause for a minute and ask. Allie, if I'm a commercial, if I'm any airport sponsor, anything after round one that would make us, am I better off to say, hey, I've got 6 asks? Do I throw in my 1 or maybe 2 that I really, that's the ones that are game changers or most important to me? Or do I give them all 6 and maybe they range from I'm buying $1 million jet bridge to I got a $15 million, and give the FAA that cafeteria list? So maybe they want to give me something and they want to just sort of fit it into their bucket of price. Any insights that we gained in round 1 to that approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say there were a number of airports, particularly larger airports, that got multiple bites at the apple and multiple projects on this list. And clearly they did split them up and go in separately. We also know there were airports that went in on a bigger package of projects, and FAA came back and said, can we tool this down, either for cost reasons or just for eligibility reasons, right? And making sure that everything they were going for was within the realm. And so I do think probably the answer, if you've got a long list, is probably not just pick your one. You can go in with a couple. I'm not sure what the answer is on should you have 15 or should you break it up and overwhelm them with applications. And I think that's something you can feel out with your ADO. But I think in general that people who put in 2 or 3 and broke up their program into a menu, it seems not to have been something where FAA said we're only going to do 1 from that selection, and people missed out that way.
I've got a thought on that as well. Just as a reminder, those categories on the ATP in particular, that was dictated by statutory stuff. So if you actually look at the list, you could tell, an airport, got something for $150,000. My question is, did that just fill in the gap in order to, allocate 100% or as close to 100% of the money that was in that particular bucket? For example, for non-hub airports, got 146 million, for example. So I would suggest if you had multiple projects that you don't forget about those I don't call them low-bearing fruit, but ones that aren't $30 million or $20 million or $10 million or even $5 million. Look at providing some of those projects that are perhaps be able to just fill in the gap because they need to, secure those funds and allocate those funds within that one bucket, if that makes any sense to anybody.
Very much so.
Hey, David, I'm curious to know, can you, or maybe Ali, provide some examples of those smaller scale procurements? I know Greg mentioned the snow removal equipment, but just curious to know what are you seeing folks procure for those lower amounts?
Sure. BGI in Minnesota got $95,000 for expanding a security checkpoint to better define and improve the control. I've got $380,000 from airport in North Dakota for construct a new general aviation terminal. $855,000 for, again, another general aviation terminal. Those are just some of them. Let me think here on the list. $665,000, $540,000. Another, they're renovating the FIS facility. So, we always want to, grab for the 50 million or the one, but don't forget about those smaller projects is my overall point, that can fill in those gaps to that statutory bucket along the way.
I enjoyed Augusta, Kansas got $36,000 for a new HVAC system, right? Like some of this is very small. Do I know what Augusta, Kansas's full list of needs were and whether they submitted other things? I do not, but I know that $36,000 is not, it's a drop in the bucket of the overall program. So
I set you up for that easy one, Ali. You're welcome.
Yeah. I did double check that I had enough zeros in that before I said it out loud, but.
Any feedback again, others, experiences through the process, things that surprised you, things that don't make sense? Ali, yes, sir. Go ahead, Dave.
Greg, on the AIG, I know you've got some thoughts and things like that. You want to just take a moment to kind of walk through what your thoughts are and your general observations are being out in the real world, and how do you think that's going, and any advice you have to anyone?
Sure. That sets it up. I probably got more questions than thoughts and advice, Dave, but thanks. Glad to cover it. Love to hear any feedback for anybody who's willing to share what's happening. Our company, I reach across a good part. So a lot of different ADOs, but by no means all of them. And well, I know some grants have been issued under the AIG to date. Most of my experience so far has been FA is wicked busy just trying to get AIP out, right? And then once these ATP announcements were made, I've had a few where, okay, all of a sudden they got to get those ATP grants written before the end of the fiscal year. And so quickly wanted to verify bid numbers or actual values, to Ali's point, if they were construction ready or if something needed to be rebid now if the clock had passed, say, at awarding a bid. And so in my personal world, I think I had one sponsor where I said, shoot, let's throw it in. Let's force them to deal with it one way or the other. I hope they're not. I hope my ADO folks are not on the phone listening to that. But because otherwise they were saying, hey, listen, we haven't been given direction. We don't know yet. basically kind of pushing it off. But for those that wish to incorporate it with other funds, and what I mean by that is not mixing them, as we all know they need to be usable units, but covering a usable unit that is part of a larger program or effort, but important time-wise. So I'd be anxious if others, for the group of all who chose to come have some coffee this morning, would share what they've experienced. Again, there have been some grants issued and awarded. We can all go see that on FA's website. So it's happening, and I don't know if those ADOs are overachievers or they didn't have as much AIP to get out, but they're all very, very busy with that. Some are probably still doing some cleanup to the CRISA and ARPA sort of stuff, to Allie's point. And I know that Allie is always helpful to us, our team, with the reallocation of some of those funds. There are people who sort of failed to get their grants done and signed, despite an ADOPM or somebody getting after them, or if they don't draw them down, what happens? So to Allie's point, being ready and having stuff in front and having your ADO or other folks aware of your needs, because when that reallocation comes, it may not sort of see the light of day, if I can say that. It just may get done and dished out. But those are my thoughts, Dave. Anybody, comments, feedback to that, or their experiences with AIG today? All right, it's a quiet bunch. Either the coffee's really good or it's not very good. Sorry, Allie, I was going to ask sort of one question that I know I've asked you before, but for the group's benefit. Any value, or would we suspect anybody, the cost sharing? There have been times in some funding efforts in the past where a sponsor offering, instead of just say their typical 90-10 split, said, hey, we'll pay 20%, lower the share, make it, that's that important to us. Any of that at all? Has that been part of in your former life discussions when some of this stuff was being formulated in the halls of Congress or in its implementation, where a sponsor could sort of increase their profile or their standing because they were willing to say, well, we'll pay more local share to do that?
Yeah, I feel like that comes and goes in waves, and you see it in one year, it'll be written in that it's to the advantage of a sponsor to do that. And then another year in the appropriations bill, they'll say you cannot consider cost share as one of the advantages or private participation. I'd say, and generally that tends to follow the Republican leaders in Congress appreciate a larger cost share. The Democrats generally want to open it up and say, if we're saying 80%, we mean 80%. If we're saying 95%, we mean 95%. Have not seen, conclusive evidence on how FAA is thinking about that right now, other than they may not be trying to reward a larger cost share, but they do like when they can award to more projects. And so, get the question of, okay, but what could you do with this amount of money? And being ready for that question, I think, is very, very helpful, because it allows you to, get the full request in, but being prepared to take advantage of whatever opportunities you're given is how I'd put that.
All right, our time draws close. So I'll pause again, see anyone, questions, comments. Sorry, I do see I had a question in the chat box. Ellie, I can repeat it. Is there really a September 30 deadline for money to be obligated under the new programs?
There is not. For FY22 AIG grants, if that's what you're talking about is AIG and ATP, FY22 grants from AIG have to be obligated by the end of fiscal year 25. And that's when they roll back in and you get a competitive round in 26 from those unobligated funds. So you got a little window, and I know that, there are more flexibilities in terms of reimbursements on those and looking to forward years on AIG, but you do have time on that first round of AIG money.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Good question, Jim. Jim, and I'll share an experience. One of my clients, the General Aviation Airport, and was successful for a new terminal facility, actually a terminal and a vault. So sort of two projects, both are listed separately inside that ATP grant. And once announced, the ADO asked how quickly we could sort of revise the apps. Were we ready? Were the numbers still good? The truth was the sponsor had already awarded the contracts. We had provisions. I mean, it's a little bit like buying a lottery ticket. We were moving ahead with or without ATP funding. Then it was only an issue that we had not expended or proceeded far enough that we were into the federal money. Obviously, it wasn't going to be treated as any sort of reimbursement. So what work had been started or was underway had to be within the limits of what would be their local share to that ATP grant. But the ADO was anxious to get it granted in FY22, but to Alex's point, wasn't a requirement. They said, if you can move pretty fast, get us the app revised, we can get this grant issued pretty fast. If not, it'd just be sort of early 23. So it seemed to be there was some sort of processing thing in their world, whether they were going to get them written here in August or have to kind of kick around a few months later, but not because of the money wouldn't be there, just something in the processing part. So I can't add any more to that, but was helpful for us to be really ready to rock and roll with them. And I have a second that we will rebid, not because the bids expired, just because the silly pricing these days came in stupid high. And we thought we can make some changes and get back down to just reasonably stupid, not really stupid high. So
Greg,
Greg,
can
you
I close with my favorite anecdote from the ATP legislation?
you can indeed.
I'll be really quick, but one thing is we talk about, trying to look toward FAA reauthorization and making sure if you've got any thorny issues on your list, communicating them to your members of Congress. I just want to say, if you look at it, I mean, it's a terminal program, right? But then there are 2 tower awards, and it's written as named the airport terminal program, but includes airport-owned towers. And that is a thorny issue that a few airport sponsors have been having with FAA, trying to get their tower on the replacement list for a long time. They took it to their members of Congress who had been, again, squeaky wheel with FAA. Didn't work. Finally put it in the legislation for ATP that these towers were eligible. And I think you could probably guess, based on the list of which towers were awarded in that first round, which senators were complaining and trying to get that as part of FAA's plans. And so it's just one example of how if something is a bit of a brick wall with FAA, may take time, but good to raise it, take these opportunities ahead of reauthorizations where it's easiest to make adjustments to get things in front of your congressional delegation if you have that opportunity to.
Oh, sorry. Dave, anything you want to add real quick before we wrap up?
Sure. If this ticket right here is actually the winning ticket, I'll fund 3 projects.
Be sure to let us all know where the application process starts. You like it.
It'll be a very intense application process. But yes, I will fund 3 projects.
Thank you all very much. Cody and Ryan, thanks so much for letting us participate today and lead this conversation. Enjoyed it with everybody, and as well to Bob. So thank you all. And here's some contact information, please. If you wanted to follow up individually with Dave or Alec, if you thought either of them could shed a little light or a second opinion, or whatever, happy to share that with you. So reach out to them, either phone or email. Thanks, Cody.
And thank you, Greg. Great content today. I always like to learn how the money flows. Very important to our business. Thank you all for joining us for this month's coffee conversation. And be looking on the social medias and in your inboxes for notice of the next one. And thank you again to CMT for your sponsorship. And if any of the folks out there want to sponsor, again, please check out Ryan Sizemore's email address in the meeting notes today, and we'll get you hooked up. Have a great day, everybody.